maturing in your faith walk is coming into the realization that there's not only a difference between spirit and flesh, but also that there's a time and a place to exercise your God-given authority. And when you do so, you're using it in wisdom in the way God needs you to. Now, the reason why I say this is because when a lot of us find ourselves in Christ and we gain that authority, that God-given authority God has given us through the power of his spirit, a lot of us like to use that as a way to be spiritual bullies, as a way to tear people down more than bring people up, because we spent all of our lives we spent being torn down ourselves. And so we use it as like some sort of like weapon to try to, make ourselves feel good about ourselves, or try to, boost up our egos, because we spent all of our lives being hurt by others. And that's why God needs to mature us. That's why God needs to cultivate us in these areas, and having us come to the realization that it is not the physical person in which you are fighting against, but it is what is deeply rooted inside them in which you have to combat against. Let me repeat that again. It is not the person, physically, the flesh. That's not what you're warring against. But you're warring against what is deeply rooted inside them. That's the pride, that's the ego, that's the anger, the resentment, the bitterness. That's the insults. That's what's deeply rooted in them, the hatred. And once we come to the realization that, we'll start to be more aware than offended. And when we start to be more aware than offended, then we can get to the deeply rooted issues in these things. We'll start to be able to know how to combat against these tactics in which the enemy is using these people through to get a rise out of you. And the reason why I say this is because God had me in 2 Corinthians 10, in which Paul was dealing with the same thing with the Corinthians. The Corinthians were very competitive, very self-driven, very, lacking in unity, very prideful, very egotistical, self-righteous many times. And it was because of their pride and their lack of wanting to be taught, their lack of wanting to, their lack of receiving the knowledge and the wisdom God was trying to give them through Paul, in which they were used by the enemy to combat against Paul. And like I said, Paul was going through this with them because the Corinthians felt like Paul was very timid in person, but he was very bold in his letters. That's what we see throughout the New Testament. Paul's very assertive. He's very authoritative in his letters. And the Corinthians thought at a very surface level. They believed in the way that they thought, the way that the world taught them how to be authoritative. They thought that's how Paul should come to them, not knowing that there's a way in which God was using Paul to come to them with the authority in which God deems as authority, not what the world deems as authority or authoritative. And they just felt like Paul was just, like we like to say, a keyboard warrior. They just felt like Paul was just very, very bold in the letters, but just very scary in person. And it wasn't that. Paul just knew how to exercise his authority in wisdom. With all the insults, with everything that Paul had to go through with the Corinthians, it's not that Paul was scary in person. In fact, Paul was doing what Jesus was doing on his ministry, walking in love, walking in humility. But when it was time for that lion to come out, Jesus exercised it. What the enemy was trying to do through the Corinthians is that the enemy was trying to use the Corinthians to get a rise out of Paul, to try to convince Paul that once he moved out of his flesh, that he wasn't who God told him that he was. And that's what the enemy does for a lot of people. The enemy tries to use people to get you out of your body, so that when you get out of your body, he could convince you that you are not who God said you are. Oh, how could you say this? Or how could you get out of your body? How can you get in your flesh and you're supposed to be this holy, righteous man or woman of God? But the enemy uses accusations. He uses assumptions. He uses false accusations to get in your head. And that's why the Corinthians felt like that Paul should have came to them in a certain way. They're like, you're not as bold as you say. You're not as bold as you deem in your letters. But it wasn't the case. Paul is like, I just know how to use it. I just know how to exercise that in wisdom. And Paul realized that it wasn't humans waging war against humans. He realized that it was the spirits. And that's why he told him to take every thought captive and make it obedient to God. Whatever you meditate on, and this is why God says, let us not be conformed to the patterns of this world. Whatever we meditate on is what we'll start to practice. So the Corinthians were very worldly, they were very secular, so all they did was practice things of the world and not the things of God. And wonder why they had certain thoughts, wonder why they were exercising certain ways. And that's because they weren't meditating on the truth. They were meditating on what the world deemed as authoritative. And what the world deems as authoritative, I can say, is just very narcissistic. What the world deems as authoritative is having control, having so much control over a person or over a crowd of people to the point where you're belittling them, where you're making them feel less than to boost up your ego. But the authority in which God wanted to explain to the Corinthians that was being used to Paul was not that it's not that he's timid or he's scary, but it's the fact that he is using his authority not to tear you guys down, but to build you up. Because when you use your authority to build others up, that is the authority, that is the right authority in which is being used rightfully through God, from God through you. And that's why God is saying we've got it all wrong. We're spending more time lacking in unity. We're spending more time being competitive and comparing ourselves to one another, which the Corinthians were doing, comparing themselves amongst one another, that we don't even see the bigger picture. We do not even see the bigger picture because we're so worried and focused on ourselves instead of building the kingdom up. And I just believe that God is trying to get to the church right now, is that we have to use the authority which God has given us to lift others up. Walk in humility, walk in love. I understand the enemy is trying to get you out of your body. I understand that the enemy is trying to pull out his best stops to try to get you to move in your flesh. But you have to look at it beyond the flesh. You have to look at it beyond the flesh, realize the spirit. That's why God tells us to put on the full armor of God. That we don't wrestle against flesh and blood, but rulers and principalities. That's why he tells us to be slow to anger and slow to speak, but be quick to listen. Because when you're quick to listen, you're quick to be able to operate out of what you're listening to. When you listen and meditate on what you're listening to, then that's how you can move in the direction in which the things in which you are listening to. And it's like they even tried to convince Paul that he wasn't who God said he was. They tried to, judge him for how he looked. They tried to judge him for how he spoke. And let me tell you this, you don't have to sound churchy. You don't have to look the parts. God can use anything. God just wants to see where your heart is at. So it don't matter if you got a whole bunch of piercings on your face. It don't matter if you got a whole bunch of tattoos all on your face. It don't matter how you dress. God just wants to see where your heart is at. Because God can use any and everything to get his message across. So don't let people try to don't let what's deeply rooted inside people be used to dim your light, or be used to get you back to a place that you no longer want to go. Go back to a place where you're easily offended. Go back to a place where you're stepping out of alignment. Because all offense does is move you out of alignment. All offense does is move you out of your rightful place in which God has placed you in. So stay rooted, stay guarded. Don't let what other people say about you deeply affect you in any way, shape, or form possible. Because it's not true. So walk in your authority. Walk in the way God has taught you. Not in the way that the world has taught you. Not in the way the world is trying to encourage you to use your authority. Because you have an impact. And whether you like it or not, your authority and your words impact a lot of people. So use it in the right way and use it in the way God has called you to. So yeah, that's it. I love you. So does God. God bless.